And first up is Arnold Hirshon, who retired in December of 2021 as the Vice Provost and University Librarian at Case Western Reserve University. Arnold is also a very experienced consultant for libraries. He's done some advising work for the Carnegie Foundation for major research universities in South Africa, and has also been doing some consulting around a new university that will be established in Vietnam. He's also a former president of the Association for Library Collections and Technical Services, and he recently completed his term as chair of the management board for a consortium of, or an association of library consortia in more than 40 developing countries around the world. So please welcome Arnold to kick off our Friday afternoon portion of the program.
Thank you, Hugh. And I'm going to share my screen, and I hope everybody can see it. And if so, then we can get started. So this is going to be a two-part presentation. It's one grows out of the other. And if my screen will advance, that would help. So the first part, I'm going to talk about the upcoming publication of Alice in the World of Wonderlands, the English language editions of the 4 Alice books published worldwide, which I will be calling AWOW-E. And when it finally comes out, I will be saying AWOW-E. And the second part is an update from the essay that I wrote for that on the evolution of visual representations of Wonderland in the English language editions, specifically of Alice in Wonderland, not through the looking glass. So let's get started and talk about the publication of Alice in the World of Wonderland. This is a complementary work to the translations book that came out, Alice in the World of Wonderland's translations, came out in 2015. Alan Tenenbaum was the technical editor of that, and the editor was John Linseth. John, I need to correct the abstract for today's program. This is not Hirshon's Alice in the World of Wonderlands. This is really John Linseth's Alice in the World of Wonderlands, and I was fortunate that he invited me to come on and serve as co-editor, but this is really his, very much his brainchild. The book designer, for those of you who know book design, is Jerry Kelly, and our publisher will be Atbosh. I'll give more information about the publication schedule in a moment, but the scope is what we call the 4 Alice books, on Alice's Adventures Underground with a lowercase u, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, Through the Looking Glass, and The Nursery Alice. It is in 2 volumes. Volume 1 is essays. You will see some of your colleagues listed on this screen as having written essays for this, and there are 3 types of essays. The first part is Beyond the Front Matter, essays about the publishing history and the text of the book. One of the things is this contains what we believe to be the last work written by Morton Cohen during his lifetime about Carroll and his relationship with Carroll. It also has in-depth essays about the publishing history and analysis of the text, and a definitive bibliography of all the known copies inscribed by Carroll as presentation copies that was prepared by Edward Wakeland. Part 3 is essays about the illustrated editions. I'll talk about mine in a moment, but there's also a wonderful essay by George Cassidy that he just self-describes as by a cranky, curmudgeonly, contrarian view about the British publications of Looking Glass. There is Michael Everson's essay about translating the canonical illustrations by Byron Sewell, and an essay by Mark Burstein about the comics, Alice in the Comics. There's also part 4 is the life essays, and a number of people have written essays, including, as you heard this morning, it was morning for me anyway, But Selwyn's essay is there, as well as many other people. I think you will find these essays to be illuminating and quite entertaining in many cases, and certainly fascinating to find out more about how and why people have become collectors or interested in following the life of Alice. Volume 2 are the checklists. In addition to the 10 checklists, UK and US Alice's Adventures, the other English language countries, which are Australia, Canada, Ireland, New Zealand, and then the rest of the world. The combined editions are included in that as well. And then the Looking Glass editions, Underground editions, Nursery Alice, Annotated Alice, pop-ups, and movable editions as well. Anytime you do an endeavor such as this, you have to make decisions what to include and what not to include. So this is primarily books, printed books, ebooks, online editions. It includes some abridged versions, some retellings. Generally omitted are parodies, stage plays, radio broadcasts, musical performances, sheet music, coloring books, fan fiction, poem books, such as a pop-up book of just Jabberwocky is not included in this. Audio and video recordings, unless they were accompanying a published book. And it does not include single or separately published illustrations that did not appear in a published book about Alice in one of her forms. The checklists we closed that in late 2021. Anytime you do a volume such as this, you know that you're going to miss things. So we know that that may happen. And we know that there will be new ones coming up and that they're not going to be included if they showed up after our close date. One of the changes this time is that we have indexes with entry numbers. So on the right side, you see a typical page. And if you wanted to look, for example, in the Illustrator index to find the entries that have Julia Green, you would find, for example, this one, entry number 2120, is one that Julia Green co-illustrated with Helen Pettis. The checklist contributors, there are 38 people who contributed to forming these checklists. There were 6 people who led the checklist compilations. Some did one, Selwyn did 3 of them, as you see here. And you can easily see why, if you were here to hear his performance this morning, it was quite entertaining and quite informative. And his scholarship is just tremendous and really helped us in this effort, as did Joel Berenbaum, George Cassidy. John himself did one of the checklists, Stephanie Lovett and Lenny DeRoy in the Netherlands. So volume 2 appendices, there's a publication history of the 4 Alice books. There's a publisher index, including an introduction to the publisher checklist entries, an illustrator index with a statistical overview. And I'm going to go through a little bit of what you might find there. So some quick facts and figures that you may find as you look through the checklist entries. In the translation books, there were 7,994 entries. In the English language editions, we have 4,358. So between the two of them, there are 12,352 entries. And of course, translations closed in 2015. There have been new translated editions since then. So we know this is an underestimate, as any printed book such as this always will be, because tomorrow something else new will come out. The number of entries broken out by broad category. No surprise, Alice is 51.5% of all the entries. Looking Glass comes in next at 21%, and combined editions are 23%. And then, of course, underground and pop-ups are much, much smaller numbers. In terms of the trends, this table appears in the volume, but it's not very easy to interpret in a presentation such as this. So a couple of quick overviews. This chart gives us a sense of the relative extent of publishing activity within a single decade. And it's stacked, so you can see that, again, Alice is predominating and where it is as a percentage of the whole. This gives you a trend line of Alice, Looking Glass, and the combined editions since the beginning. And so from 1865, going by 10-year decades, up through 2020, really through 2021. The nursery Alice and Alice's Adventures Underground are not shown here because, as I said, the numbers were so small you can't really extrapolate anything statistically meaningful. What you can see here, though, if you look at the Alice line, which is the purple line, represents 56%. In this diagram, there are some reasons why that is a little bit different from the previous graph that I just showed you. I'm not going to go into those details now. Alice, you can see, hit her first peak in 1900 to 1909 decade. Then she slumps for quite a while, and she only regains 100 years later, restoring and going beyond that original peak. Looking Glass, which is the gold or brown line, depending upon what your monitor looks like. That's as a standalone publication. You can see its trend line kind of mirrors and follows the same path as most of the Alice single editions do. Unlike Alice, when Looking Glass went out of copyright in 1948, you did not see it spawning a lot of new editions as you did for Alice in 1908, 1909, in 1907, 1908, 1909. And then from the 1930s to the 1950s, there are about 30% fewer Looking Glass editions than for Alice, and I posit some theories about that as to why that would be in the book. The combined editions were first issued in the United States in 1881. Macmillan waited until 1911 to issue the first UK edition, and then no other UK publisher did so until 1920. While the issuance of Alice standalone volumes declined from 1930 to 1979, you can see the combined edition activity rose. And in every decade, the number of Alice standalone editions significantly exceeds those of the combined editions. Starting in 1920 to 29, the number of combined editions begin to exceed that of the new Looking Glass editions. And you, of course, see this spike in this most recent period of suddenly Looking Glass exceeding combined editions. This could be an anomaly. You certainly can't extrapolate, as my statistics professor would have said, from a datum. So in terms of the number of unique illustrators, Translation Book had listed 1,201. The English language editions, we have 647 that did not have an edition represented in translations. So therefore, we're saying 1,848 unique illustrators, some of whom did this in combination with a second illustrator, a third illustrator within a single book. 142 illustrators appear on both lists. Out of that, so there's 792 total in the English language checklists, 647 unique. 35% of the total are in English language editions only, and only 8% appeared in both the English language and the translated editions. There are some notable English language illustrators who have no edition in translation. I won't read all these names to you, but you can, some of them, there are very good reasons why, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And there are also a number of non-Tenniel illustrators in English language editions. These are in order of frequency, so the next most represented is Harry Roundtree, for example. Disney, it's no surprise that that comes up very high. And then I'll talk about some of these other illustrators in a little while. There are some interesting curiosities like English language illustrators who did make it into editions in translation, but whose editions in English language editions are not especially well known, and in some cases are not very good. This is a selective list, by the way, not exhaustive. And there are editions in translation illustrators who made it into an English language edition. And you can see some of them here: Tove Janssen, Jan Svankmajer, Kete Brakatika, and Gennady Kalinowski. So why did some English language edition illustrations never appear in the translation edition? Well, it could have been poor quality of the original illustrations. Certainly the ubiquity of the Tenniel illustrations. 49% of all English language translations are by Tenniel. Cost of acquisition might have been too high for the publisher, or the publisher said, I can just hire a new illustrator at a lower cost. Could have been copyright restrictions, and they might have actually respected copyright, unlike the US publishers who did not. The lack of technology to readily reproduce the images effectively by a particular publisher. It might have been a limited edition, not meant for a mass market. Certainly the one that I showed a moment ago of, go back to this for a moment, of Marie Laurencin. That was a very limited edition, never appeared outside of that one edition. The illustrator just had a much better literary agent representing and able to get into multiple markets. And finally, there may have been too many cultural references that simply didn't translate into another language or another country. So the next steps for us, the first thing is to get the publication out the door. We are still finishing and finalizing things in the manuscript. It'll initially come out in a deluxe limited edition, probably be 100 copies. Many of those are already committed. There will be very high quality binding and very high quality paper with full color images and image correction. I believe it will be available by this summer. The standard edition will come out later, probably about 6 months after the deluxe edition. That'll be a print on demand, hardbound. It'll be 20-pound paper. I should point out that this will be in 2 volumes that collectively are about 1,000 pages. And the availability will probably be this coming winter. And then we may do an ebook edition that may just be a volume 1, and that would probably be about a year from now. The other is I get repeatedly questions about the database. We're looking to combine the translation and English language database to create a single database, to then start working on trying to update and add post-2015 entries for translations, reconstruct all of those incredible non-Roman character sets and diacritics that Alan Tannenbaum did an amazing job with, and adding a country of publication field because that was organized by language, not country of origin. And then for the English language database, we need to make sure that all the updates that we've been putting into the print version get moved back into the online version. And then longer term, we're looking at how do we edit this and keep it up to date, make it available, manage the infrastructure, and where is it going to be physically hosted? How do people get search, access, retrieval, and hosting sites? So from that, I'm going to now move on to some things from the essay that I did on, started out Beyond Tenniel, the Evolution of Visual Representations of Wonderland by illustrators of the English language editions. I should point out this is about 200 pages, highly, highly illustrated. There are over 400 illustrations in this. And what I set out to do was a systematic, comprehensive exploration of the English language editions after Tenniel, of Wonderland to uncover the first appearance or significant change in a setting, a scene, a character, a sentence, a word, a phrase. And I've given a couple of presentations to Lewis Carroll Society on this before, while my research was still in development. So the essay covers, starts with the first non-Tenniel, but Carroll authorized illustrations, then moves on to the American pirated editions. Then the 1907, 1908 really went into 1909 a little bit, tidal wave of primarily British publications, although there were some US ones tucked away in there. Then moving on to the early 20th century from 1910 on to 1925, then moving into the later 20th century up through 1999, and then in the 21st century. Now, I should point out, this was selective. Once I get past 1908, 1909, trying to ascertain who was truly the first to do something, especially because editions and translations start coming up. I start looking for interesting things that I don't think anybody did, but I can't guarantee that they didn't. So I picked illustrators that I thought might have something interesting to point out. These are not necessarily always the best, although I think most of them are better. And there are many more I could have picked, but it is a selective list of 61 illustrators in total. This gives you a little bit of an idea of what the page design looks like. This is Louis Jesse Bridgman and some of his illustrations and vignettes. This one is Thomas Maybank, who has both color illustration and black and white illustration. And so you'll see the full color illustrations, very often full page illustrations of some of these as well, along with my commentary about each figure that appears. So what are some of the more interesting findings that I came upon as I was doing the research? So I was asked a question by Mark Burstein as I was finishing up. Actually, I had finished up. And he sent me this illustration from Margaret Tarrant's 1916 edition. And it's Alice wondering to herself, it'll be no use, they're putting their heads down and saying, come up again, dear. She's imagining that her parents are looking to try and find where she is. I would assume that that's her sister standing up, and it is her Dinah the cat standing outside with her father having taken his top hat off so they could all look down the rabbit hole. And the question that Mark asked me was, do I know of any other editions where this passage was specifically illustrated in any way? And I haven't come up with any. I don't know of any other besides this one. But the other similarity that I started to notice was to Millicent Sowerby's illustration of Alice following the rabbit down the rabbit hole. For those of you who are not familiar with real rabbit holes, they are generally on the sides of hills, not straight down. And so both of these accurately illustrate what a rabbit hole would look like. But now we have Alice peering into the rabbit hole, whereas Tarrant has the parents peering into the rabbit hole. And since Tarrant comes out in 1916, I do have to wonder how familiar she was with Sowerby's illustration. Other similarities, Harry Roundtree in 1908 has Alice in the Pool of Tears with the mouse leaping out of the water when Alice starts talking about Dinah the cat. And the positioning of the two seems quite similar to me. And again, I think Tarrant has to have been familiar with Roundtree's illustration. The primary difference is the flipping of the location of Alice and the mouse left to right, right to left. If you flip it the other way, you get a little bit better sense. Of course, the mouse, Alice is facing the back, whereas as opposed to facing the front. but still I find this pretty similar. Let's look at the portrayals of the mock turtle. So Robinson, Thomas Heath Robinson, over on the left, 1908. He's got his mock turtle with the top hat, rather forbidding face. I believe you might be able to discern a bit of a tear coming out of his right eye. You see Alice is looking away. She's neither looking at the griffin nor is she looking at the mock turtle. And then in the middle, we have Margaret Tarrant's image. You see the mock turtle in the pot of soup with his legs coming out of the bottom of the pot. You see the steam from the soup coming out. Again, crying, no doubt crying, because if you were in a steaming bowl of soup, pot of soup, you'd be crying too. But I don't know how the water from the soup is not all leaking out the bottom if the legs are there. Must be a very tight seal there. And then we have Bessie Pease Gutman's illustration of the mock turtle with a slice of, I assume it's lime from the color. It could have been a lemon, but I think it's a lime. I'm not quite sure why it's there. Maybe one squeezes lime juice into a mock turtle soup. And a very blobby looking griffin also there with Alice. So we have other portrayals of the mock turtle. In the late 20th century, we have Ralph Steadman's famous building custodian as mock turtle. And we also have Barry Mosher's crying mock turtle from his 1983 woodcut edition. We also have images of the mock turtle as a toy by Charles Robinson in 1907. And we have Gavin O'Keefe. Gavin O'Keefe has two full illustrated editions. The second one was in 2011. This comes from the 2011 edition, and they are very different, those two editions. So the Gavin O'Keefe has him as a wind-up toy. We also have the mock turtle in the mock turtle's school days. So Harry Roundtree has the turtle running out of school, school's out, whereas Angel Dominguez did all the mock turtle in class with all of the other students, and you see numerous fascinating things all around the room. Charts, my favorite of which is the hooks that are on the middle left side of this, no doubt teaching them how to avoid being hooked as a turtle on someone's line. Also part of that scene, we have throwing the lobsters out to sea, the first one of which is 1907, W.H. Walker has this as the first illustration, and it's the first one, his was black and white edition, in the act of actually throwing the lobsters out to sea, versus Thomas Heath Robinson's 1908 illustration, also black and white. Very different, very dense illustration. You see the mock turtle there with his top hat on in the back. The griffin is much more prominent in this. You can see the lobsters all swelling up against the wave. And then you've got Margaret Tarrant, again in the same sort of position as W.H. Walker's, in the position of throwing the lobsters out to sea as opposed to being in the sea with them. And Terrence is the first color illustration of the scene. Going back to that comment and question that Mark asked me, I had not originally spent any time in the essay doing Margaret Tarrant, but I found as I went back after he asked that question, I got so interested that I wound up doing a very lengthy section on Margaret Tarrant because there were just so many fascinating things that I had not really paid attention to in her edition previously. Page borders. There are a number of editions that have very different types of page borders. Peter Newell's deluxe edition. This is not in all of his editions. In his deluxe edition, Robert Murray Wright did the illustrations. They're very much in the Kelmscott Press arts and crafts style that was very prevalent in that period in publishing and in fine press publishing. Very different from that way Margaret Tarrant uses page board. She does vignettes of characters and uses the oval as the border. And you see here Alice in the lower left. You see the cat in the upper left corner. You see the cook in the upper right corner, and a pepper shaker, I'm sorry, a pepper shaker in the lower right corner. And of course, the plates are being thrown and the pans are being thrown all within the scene. And then you get the border for Bessie P's Gutman that was done by P. Micklewright. That page border is exactly the same page border on every page. Whereas in Newell's edition, there are a few different ones that keep repeating, but they're not all the same from page to page. Other themes, watches and clocks. Tarrant has certainly the first, and I'm not sure, maybe the only, where the illustration is not showing the time, it's showing the days of the month, which are mentioned, of course, in the book. But in this case, you don't see the hour in the second hand at all. You only see the days. Oleg Lipchenko's fabulous edition from 2009 with the butter in the butterworks that March Hare had put in there, dripping out and doing a word wrap around the wonderfully detailed illustration. And then Gavin O'Keefe's 2011 view of the Hatter. His hat says discounted, and then you've got the months going around his face, and the second hand and our hand on his nose, coming out of his nose. Stepping away from Carroll's 4-panel version, another thing I found interesting was many of them either repeated the 4 panels, or they did only 2 panels. George Soper in 1911 turned it into essentially a comic and did this repeat with mice throughout that are used as bordering design. And these mice are, of course, not the mouse's tail. They are just mice running around, kind of looking in and out of the scene and pulling it all together across this 2-page spread. And the first calligraphic mouse's tail that I found after Carroll's manuscript is the Vili Pogani illustrations, fabulous illustrated edition, all black and white except for the end papers, which has a wonderful color illustration. Pagani was Hungarian by birth. And so you can see very much his style of writing is very early 20th century European style writing. And he uses this concrete style, a calligraphic style, but not just in this concrete poem, but he uses it in some of the other poems and the illustrations of some of the other poems. And then the last thing I looked at was Will Brooker commented that Alice's sister is such a key character, the bearer of this adult perspective, but she's rarely shown in illustrations. Well, I beg to differ. The very first illustration in it, other than Tenniel's, that's attributed is a Dutch edition in 1887. You see Alice and her sister. Charles Copeland's Alice in Wonderland from 1893 is Alice and her sister. Annie Corey, 1902. Bessie P's Gutman in 1907. And they are not the only ones. Walter Hawes, 1908, black and white illustrations. Alice and her sister show up twice. First of all, not just one sister, but multiple sisters show up in the boat as they are taking the boat ride on that golden afternoon in a frontispiece. And then at the end, you see Alice's sister hidden behind the tree with reading the book. And Alice is looking out. And this is really meant to illustrate the opening of the book, not the closing, though it does appear physically, this illustration at the end of the book. Barry Mosher illustrated Alice's sister twice, which is unusual because his illustrated edition is Alice doesn't appear except in these and one other, the third illustration. Alice never appears because his philosophy was that we shouldn't be voyeurs. We should be seeing this journey through Alice's eyes. The picture on the left is from the beginning of the book, Alice in full view, but her sister's in the shadows. The one on the right is at the end of the book. Alice is in the distance beneath the tree. Alice is facing her sister, who's in full, Alice's sister is in full view. Alice is only seen from behind. I don't show here the pen and ink of Alice alone at the end of the book, because it's not particularly germane to this specific point. And then a few others, Anthony Brown, Alice and her sister, Arnold Dominguez, Alice and her sister. And in case you thought that in case you thought there weren't any more, there are plenty more by illustrators, good illustrators, bad illustrators, and every illustrator in between. So Alice and her sisters certainly appears numerous times. So since I finished this, I've been asked multiple questions, or I've come upon questions that get raised in some of the Alice forums. For example, Heather Simmons raised the question, which artists have illustrated the Raven and the Writing Desk? And so you see on this illustration, John Vernon Ward has illustrated it. Anthony Brown did it in 1988. I believe he may have been the first to have done it. Tatiana Yanovskaya in 2005, Nancy Wiley, Charles Van Sandwyk did it in 2 separate editions that he did. So this is not necessarily common, but it is not, it certainly has been illustrated. And again, I only was looking primarily at English language editions. So this may well be in English, in editions in translation, they may be more frequent that I wouldn't have discovered yet. Which illustrators depicted time as a character was another question raised recently on a list. And I think that Heather raised this question. And Helen Monroe was the first to do so. Tatiana did it. John Vernon Lord did it. John Vernon Lord has 2 illustrations of time within the same, in a sequence. And then in an edition in translation, we see Pat Andrea. And then just a small little thing, that sort of detail that I look for, illustrator devices to show motion. I just thought it was interesting that Helen Monroe used the flashing lines to show motion, and John Vernon Lord repeats that as Father Time is bending over. Then recently, Alan Tannenbaum said, he sent me this illustration on the left, and he said, "Who is this? Who illustrated this? It looks familiar, I just can't place it." And he said, it looks, obviously like it was after Tenniel, but who illustrated it? And the giveaway here, and it's not going to be written, the name's not written anywhere, but you see all that brush, the foliage around the illustration and around the round background. That's the giveaway. And the other way of knowing it is the page border in this particular edition. Also by, so the illustrator here is Louis Jesse Bridgman, who we discussed a little earlier. And then I just couldn't help myself, even though this was a looking glass and not a Wonderland, This sent me on another wild goose chase. Bridgman's Alice became a hodgepodge of whimsical and often irrelevant illustrations. He had a monkey in there and all sorts of characters that don't appear in the book. Here in Looking Glass, he does not illustrate, and I compared every illustration scene by scene. He does not illustrate any scene that Tenniel did not. He has none of those whimsical vignettes. He has only 3 illustrations that are either not the same or inspired by Tenniel. And one of them is this color frontispiece, also by George Copeland, which you can see in the lower right, his signature is there. There's a vignette on the title page, an illustration with a picture that's very hard to tell what it is. And Alan said, I think that Bridgman traced some of these illustrations. And I think he's absolutely right, because in some of Bridgman's illustrations, he even traced Tenniel's monogram into his own illustration, which he didn't need to do. So where do they diverge most from Tenniel? Well, the kitten at the beginning of chapter 1 on the left, Bridgman's kitten faces the opposite directions from Tenniel's at top. This is the only illustration in the entire book where Bridgman's name appears. Does not appear on the title page, by the way, but you find it in the lower right corner. You also see right above that the curlicue design, which is also very typical of his illustration style. We see over here, and you see that curlicue reappearing, and I'll come back to that in a moment. His Alice sitting on the chair with the kitten. He uses a square back chair. Copeland kept the round back chair that Tenniel had used, and for the color illustration that I just showed. And then the Jabberwock, very similar in terms of where the 2 characters are positioned, but there's much more detail in Tenniel's illustration than you see in Bridgman's. Bridgman, by the way, went on to become a notable illustrator in his own right. And of course, Tenniel has the Beamish boy getting ready to strike the Jabberwock, whereas Bridgman has the sword out and ready to lunge. So why didn't Carroll just pirate the Tenniel illustrations? Why go to the trouble of the tracing? My 2 theories: he didn't want to disorient an audience that was already familiar with Tenniel, so keep the Tenniel, or they wanted to do a quality illustration, and that meant having fresh prints, not just trying to pirate it from a bad copy from Macmillan. So with that, I come to the end of my comments, and I believe the end of my time. So I'm sorry if I leave it up to you as to what to do, but I thank you for your patience as I went through this, and I'll be happy to answer questions, if not now, then during the social hour later.
Thanks very much, Arnold. We do have a minute or so. If there's a comment in the chat regarding Bridgman's Jabberwocky's similarity to Peter Newell's.
Yes, they are somewhat similar. Of course, Newell's comes out, 8 years later, but yes, there certainly are similarities there.
And the question about how to get a hold of the book when it comes out.
Well, we will certainly, once we get this done, we will certainly publicize it heavily through the Lewis Carroll Society. That's being published in cooperation with the Society. And we will be making announcements so that people will be ready to buy.